The lantern that never dimmed. The sun had just begun to descend behind the downtown skyline, casting long golden shadows across the streets of Los Angeles. It was Ramadan, and while the city carried on with its typical buzz, honking cars, hurried steps, and the blend of urban chaos and rhythm, there was a quiet, sacred calm in one small corner of South Central. Here, in a modest two-bedroom apartment above a closed-down bakery, lived Amina Khoury, a single mother, devout Muslim, and fighter in every sense of the word. Amina, in her early 30s, wore strength like an old coat. Life had weathered her, but she remained unbroken. Her husband had passed away 3 years ago in a tragic car accident, leaving her alone with 2 children, Sami, a vibrant 8-year-old with dreams of becoming an astronaut, and Layla, a delicate 4-year-old who clung to her mother with wide eyes full of trust. Amina worked nights at a diner and mornings as a housekeeper at a nearby hotel, all while keeping the teachings of Islam close to her heart and doing everything she could to make Ramadan meaningful for her children. On this particular evening, Amina was preparing iftar, the meal to break the fast. Dates, lentil soup, some bread, and leftover rice. Nothing extravagant, but warm and made with love. The apartment smelled like cumin and cardamom. The TV in the corner played a children's cartoon in low volume as Layla colored on the floor with broken crayons. What Amina didn't know was that downstairs, just around the corner from their building, a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses stood quietly beside a parked motorcycle. He wasn't trying to draw attention to himself. He never did. The man was Keanu Reeves. Keanu wasn't there for a film or press tour. He wasn't there as an actor or a celebrity. He was there as a man who had heard a story that moved him so deeply he couldn't ignore it. Earlier that week, Keanu had gone to a small bookstore he frequented in the area, looking for a gift for a friend. The store owner, an elderly woman named Fatima, greeted him warmly. She had known Keanu for years, known his quiet generosity, his deep sense of humanity. They chatted about books, films, and the neighborhood. That's when Fatima, with a sigh that carried the weight of concern, shared the story of her niece, Amina. She told him how Amina had once been full of hope, how she had studied education in college, how she fell in love and built a life that was supposed to be stable. But fate, cruel and unrelenting, had taken her husband far too soon. Fatima explained how Amina worked herself to the bone, how she never asked for help, how she fasted through the day while still cleaning hotel rooms, and how she broke her fast only to go serve food to strangers during the graveyard shift. Keanu listened, unmoving, as the story painted a picture of quiet resilience. Something about it stuck with him. It wasn't pity he felt. It was awe. This wasn't a woman waiting for rescue. This was a woman surviving storms with nothing but grace, and he realized he had to do something. Not for recognition, not for headlines, but because sometimes the world needed reminders that kindness was still a powerful force. So now, as the sun dipped lower, Keanu gently knocked on the door of apartment 2 bits, holding a brown paper bag filled with groceries, dates, fruits, and small toys for the kids. He wasn't sure what he would say. He only knew that he wanted Amina to know she wasn't invisible. Amina opened the door slowly, her brows furrowed, cautious. The man standing there removed his sunglasses and smiled warmly. "Hi. You don't know me, and this might sound strange, but my name is Keanu." Amina blinked. "Keanu." She stepped aside, inviting him in with the grace of someone who'd long learned to suppress surprise. Layla peeked from behind the couch, and Sami rushed over, his eyes lighting up. "Is that John Wick?" he whispered, making Keanu laugh. The evening unfolded like something out of a dream. They sat together on the floor, sharing dates and soup, talking about dreams and favorite cartoons. Keanu didn't try to fix anything. He simply listened. And that was what Amina needed most. Someone to see her, someone to remind her she mattered. When it was time to leave, Keanu stood up and handed Sami a small envelope. "This is just a little something to help. No strings, just consider it a gift from one human being to another. Amina protested, but he raised a hand gently. I know pride. I know struggle. But I also know that we can't always do everything alone. And you've done more than enough. He left with a soft smile, disappearing into the night like a ghost, leaving behind something brighter than any spotlight. In the envelope was a letter, handwritten. You are the strongest person I've never met. But tonight, I had the honor of meeting you. If you ever need anything, you can reach out. I'm not a superhero. I just believe in people like you. Ramadan Mubarak. Attached was a check that would cover her rent for the next year. Amina didn't cry often. But that night, after the kids were asleep, she sat by the window, the moon shining gently through the curtain, and let the tears fall. Not because she was sad, but because, for the first time in years, she felt like the world had whispered back, "You are not alone." And somewhere, riding through the city on his motorcycle, Keanu Reeves smiled into the night, knowing that a single act of kindness had lit a lantern in the darkness that would never dim. The kindness that echoed. The following days unfolded with a kind of surreal quiet for Amina. The world outside hadn't changed. Sirens still screamed down her street at odd hours. Her neighborhood still bore the faded wounds of struggle, and the city still moved forward with relentless indifference. But inside her apartment, inside her heart, something had shifted. It wasn't just the groceries or the generous check that sat quietly in her drawer, untouched except for the time she'd hold it and reread the letter. It was the feeling that for the first time in a long time, someone had truly seen her, without judgment, without expectations. And not just someone, KeanuReeves. But Amina was not someone who let herself grow idle with hope. Her gratitude was real, deep, but she knew life had a way of testing the spirit even in the softest moments. And so she rose the next morning before dawn, prayed in silence, packed lunch for her children, and headed out to the hotel where she cleaned rooms before the city even stirred. Her feet ached, her back tightened with every lift of the vacuum, but she moved with purpose, each prayer on her lips a thread weaving strength into her soul. What she didn't know was that the ripples of that one evening were already reaching places she couldn't see. Keanu, meanwhile, couldn't shake the image of Amina's face from his mind. Not just her gratitude, but her dignity. The way she refused to act as though she deserved pity. The way she balanced exhaustion and grace like it was instinct. She had reminded him of his own mother, of women he had met on sets and in shelters, in small towns and coffee shops, those who quietly carried the weight of entire worlds without asking for applause. And it haunted him in the most beautiful way. Not as guilt, but as responsibility. He had money, influence, and access. What good was all of it if he wasn't using it to amplify stories like hers? He called Fatima again, asking carefully what more he could do without making Amina uncomfortable. Fatima, after a moment of thought, told him that Amina once had a dream, to open a small learning center for immigrant mothers, a space to teach basic English, financial literacy, and offer free child care during the classes. She used to talk about it before her husband died, Fatima said softly, but now she barely talks about herself at all. Keanu listened, his jaw tightening with quiet resolve. Then maybe, he whispered, it's time she remembers who she was. 2 days later, while Amina was folding towels in room 308, she got a call on her aging phone. She almost didn't answer. It was an unfamiliar number, but something in her gut urged her to pick up. Hello. Hi. Amina Kauri. This is Mera from the South Central Women's Council. We just received an anonymous nomination for you. It seems you've been awarded a community resilience grant for your vision in women's education. Amina stood frozen, one hand still holding a towel. What? You'll receive a starter fund of $5,000, mentorship, and access to resources if you ever want to turn your education center idea into reality. Amina's voice cracked before she could form words. She had never even applied for anything. Never dared to think anyone was watching her dreams, let alone believing in them. When she got home that night, her children rushed to her, as they always did, hungry for love and stories. But for the first time, she had something to tell them that didn't begin with maybe someday. She told Sami about the learning center. She told Layla they might get a bigger apartment one day, one where she could have her own room with yellow curtains like she always asked for. And she didn't say maybe this time. She said, Inshallah, if God wills it. And she said it with the hope of a woman who believed again. And across the city, in a studio lit by soft lamps and thick with the scent of old wood and coffee, Keanu sat with his phone turned off, ignoring the calls of directors and executives for just one evening. He wasn't thinking about scripts or stunts. He was thinking about the look in a young mother's eyes when she realized the world hadn't forgotten her. And that was the role he cherished most. A week passed, then another, and each day, Amina walked a little taller. Not because life was suddenly easy, but because it no longer felt like a solo battle. She began sketching plans for the center in the margins of her notebook. On breaks, she'd sit on hotel benches, researching community spaces and online courses. She had something to build now, not just for herself, but for every mother who felt lost in the noise of survival. One Friday night, as the call to prayer echoed from a nearby mosque and Layla fell asleep on the couch, Amina heard another gentle knock at the door. She opened it to find Keanu standing there again, a simple smile on his face, holding a small potted plant. "Fig tree," he said, stepping inside. "Symbol of peace and growth. Figured it belonged here." She took it with both hands, her throat tightening with emotion. "You've done so much," she whispered. "Not enough," he replied gently, "but maybe just enough to remind you what you're capable of." They sat in silence for a while after that. No grand speeches, no dramatic declarations, just two people sitting at a small kitchen table, sharing tea and stories. One who had lost her way but was finding it again, and the other who had found meaning in helping her remember. As Ramadan neared its final days, the small apartment felt lighter. Laughter returned. Dreams, once buried under exhaustion and grief, began to bloom like the fig tree in the window. And Keanu kept visiting, not as a celebrity, but as a friend. Sometimes with books for Sami, sometimes with puzzles for Layla, sometimes with nothing at all but time and the willingness to listen. Because sometimes the most extraordinary acts of kindness aren't loud or public. They are quiet, consistent, and rooted in empathy. And Amina, once broken by the weight of a world that overlooked her, now stood at the beginning of something new. Not just because someone helped her, but because someone believed in her when she had nearly stopped believing in herself. And that belief, that echo of kindness, would soon ripple far beyond her little apartment. The seeds of something bigger. Ramadan's final days always carried a unique energy, a blend of stillness and sacred momentum. As the fasts grew longer and the sunsets more anticipated, Amina found herself caught in a quiet transformation. It wasn't just about hunger and prayer anymore. It was about awakening. She still woke before dawn, her bones aching and her heart bracing for another long day. She still folded sheets at the hotel and wiped tables at the diner. But now, she moved with the awareness that she was building something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was preparing for something greater, something of her own. The small resilience grant had lit a spark, but what had truly changed her was Keanu's unwavering belief in her dream. And not the type of belief that hovered above her like a favor or a spotlight. No, his belief was quiet, rooted, humble. It was the kind of support that sat beside her, not above her. And that made all the difference. One evening, after tucking Layla in and helping Sami with his reading homework, Amina sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by paper scraps and a half-empty mug of tea. The apartment smelled like warm bread and cinnamon, comforts that came cheap but carried weight. She scribbled notes furiously in a second-hand notebook, diagramming ideas for the learning center. Her goal wasn't to make money. It wasn't even to gain recognition. She just wanted to create a safe space. For women like her. For mothers. For daughters. For those who had been told they were too quiet, too foreign, too invisible to matter. She wanted to offer evening classes for mothers who worked during the day. She wanted to build a reading corner for kids so mothers wouldn't have to choose between education and childcare. She wanted to teach women how to open a bank account, how to apply for jobs, how to say no without shame. And she wanted to do it all with dignity. No handouts, just hands held out in partnership. And then one Saturday morning, everything changed again. Amina received a call from the city's community space coordinator, a kind woman named Leah, who said someone had anonymously paid a year's lease for a vacant space on West Florence Avenue, right across from a local mosque. Leah explained that the keys were waiting at the office. "We don't usually see this kind of thing," she said softly. "Whoever did this believes in you." Amina stood still for a moment, the foam pressed against her ear, as Layla tugged at her sleeve, asking for cereal. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't speak. She just whispered, "Alhamdulillah," again and again under her breath. Praise be to God. It was Keanu. She knew it. She hadn't seen him in days, but his presence lingered like a warm light in the corners of her life. She never asked for any of this. She never had to. He simply paid attention. And in doing so, he changed everything. That same afternoon, Amina walked to the new space with her children. It was modest, a former corner store with dusty windows and faded signage. But when she unlocked the door and stepped inside, it felt like home. The walls were cracked, the floor needed polishing, but to her, it was a palace. Layla ran across the room with wild delight while Sami pulled out a notebook and started sketching what the new classroom could look like. Amina stood in the center, her hand pressed to her chest, and cried. Not tears of sadness, but the tears of a woman who had carried so much for so long she forgot what it felt like to be carried even for a moment. Over the next few weeks, that old corner store became something else entirely. Keanu showed up often, sometimes in the early mornings with a tool belt slung across his shoulder, sometimes late at night with boxes of donated books and rugs for the children's reading area. He refused to be thanked. He just rolled up his sleeves, swept floors, painted walls, and shared quiet meals with Amina and the kids, never bringing cameras, never seeking credit. It wasn't about that for him. It never was. He listened to Amina's vision, her plans, her worries, and he offered what she truly needed, presence. He didn't try to take over. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He just stood beside her, brick by brick, as she built something beautiful from the ashes of her struggle. One night, after a long day of cleaning and organizing, Keanu sat on the floor with Sami, helping him assemble a Lego model of the solar system, while Layla fell asleep curled up on Amina's lap. The radio played soft Arabic music in the background, and the room glowed with string lights they had hung across the ceiling earlier that week. "You know," Amina said quietly, looking over at him, "when my husband died, I didn't cry for the first few months. I couldn't. There was just no space for it. Grief got pushed aside by survival. I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again." Keanu looked up from the model, his eyes soft. "And now?" he asked. She smiled, brushing Layla's hair from her face. "Now I feel like I'm waking up again. Like the world isn't just something to endure anymore. It's something I can shape." Keanu nodded, saying nothing at first. Then he looked at Sami and back at her. "You're not just shaping it. You're changing it." And she was. The word had started to spread. Women from the neighborhood, immigrant mothers, single caretakers, refugees, began to stop by the space to see what was happening. Some came just to peek through the window. Others stayed for tea. They asked questions. They offered help. They donated books, brought snacks, and volunteered to teach. One of them, a woman named Zainab, had spent years in silence after leaving an abusive marriage. She offered to run art therapy sessions for the children. Another, Miriam, who had once been a nurse in Syria, wanted to lead health and wellness talks in Arabic. The learning center wasn't just opening, it was becoming a movement. a sanctuary, a home. And at the center of it all stood Amina, not as a leader in the traditional sense, but as a light, a quiet, unwavering light that pulled others out of the dark. As Eid approached, the end of Ramadan drew near. Preparations began across the city. Lights hung from balconies, sweets baked in every kitchen. And in that little center on West Florence Avenue, the children made lanterns out of colored paper while their mothers laughed over mint tea. Amina looked around the room and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not because everything was perfect, not because the struggle had ended, but because, at last, she wasn't walking alone, and the path ahead no longer felt impossible. And in the corner, sitting quietly by the bookshelf with Layla in his lap, KeanuReeves smiled, not because he had saved anyone, but because he had been allowed to witness the strength of someone who never gave up, and that he believed was the greatest honor of all. The night before Eid, by the time the moon was sighted and the community whispered the words "Eid is tomorrow," there was something different in the air, something more than just the scent of cardamom or the laughter of children running down cracked sidewalks. For Amina, Eid had always been bittersweet since her husband passed. It had once been a day of joy, of dressing the kids in new clothes and waking up to laughter and promise. But in the years since, it had become quieter, humbler, wrapped more in reflection than celebration. This year, though, felt like something new, a return, not to what was, but to what could be. The Learning Center, which still had no official name, had become the heart of the neighborhood. Every day it pulsed with life. Mothers learning English from volunteers who spoke with warmth instead of condescension, children sharing crayons and dreams, women who once walked with their eyes down now standing straighter, laughing more often. The place wasn't perfect. The paint still chipped in corners, the bathroom sink still leaked, and sometimes the lights flickered. But it didn't matter, because the people inside it made it whole. Keanu had kept coming, not with headlines or press, but with his steady, quiet presence. He never stood in the front of the room. He always sat to the side, helping clean up or reading with the kids, letting the women lead, letting Amina shine. He didn't just donate money. He donated something more rare: time, attention, belief. On the night before Eid, Amina stood alone in the center after everyone had left. The windows were lined with paper lanterns the kids had made. There were fingerprints on the walls from too many little hands painting too many stars. And in the middle of the room stood a small table wrapped in gold foil and handmade decorations. It was the Eid giving table, where each woman had brought something small: cookies, scarves, tiny toys, to share with others who had less. No one kept track of who gave what. There was no judgment, just trust, just community. Amina lit the final lantern, watching its soft glow flicker against the walls. She sat down slowly, the weight of the month settling in her bones. Her hands trembled, not from exhaustion, but from awe. How had her life turned from survival to purpose in just a matter of weeks? How had her pain become the soil from which something so beautiful had grown? As if summoned by the thought, she heard a soft knock on the door. When she opened it, Keanu stood there, holding a small wrapped box in both hands, a modest smile on his face. He was wearing a simple black hoodie, jeans, and the same worn boots he always wore when he helped with repairs. No cameras, no spotlight, just a friend arriving quietly. "I know it's late," he said softly, "but I couldn't let the night pass without stopping by." Amina stepped aside to let him in, her smile tired but genuine. She noticed he looked a little different, quieter than usual. There was something in his eyes, not sadness exactly, but something heavy, something that mirrored the weight she had once carried alone. They sat near the Eid table, the silence comfortable. He placed the box in front of her and nodded for her to open it. Inside was a framed photograph, not of him or her or the center, but of a note, handwritten, worn at the edges. "This," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "was from my mother. She gave it to me when I was 18, just before I left for New York. She said, "If you ever feel lost, help someone else find their way, and you'll find your own path in the process." Amina stared at the frame, her fingers brushing over the glass. She understood now. This wasn't about charity. It never had been. This was his way of honoring something sacred to him. And somehow, through her story, he had found a piece of his own healing. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice thick with meaning. "For everything." He shook his head. "You don't owe me thanks, Amina. You reminded me that the world still has quiet heroes. You let me witness what real strength looks like." They sat together a while longer, sipping mint tea, the night folding around them like a warm blanket. Layla was asleep in a makeshift nap corner of the center, wrapped in a small Eid dress Amina had bought from the local thrift shop. Sami had drawn a comic book featuring himself as Super Sami, protector of mothers and fighter of sadness, and had insisted it be displayed during the Eid gathering. As the hour grew late, Keanu stood to leave, his movements slow. Before walking out, he turned back to her. "Tomorrow, let's make it the best Eid the kids have ever seen." Amina smiled, her eyes sparkling under the soft lights. "Tomorrow, we celebrate, not just the end of Ramadan, but the beginning of everything that comes next." And when he left, disappearing into the calm of night, Amina stayed for a moment longer, watching the lantern sway gently. She didn't know what the future held. The center still needed funding. She still had rent to pay. And life, in all its unpredictability, would keep throwing challenges her way. But for now, she had this, a room full of dreams, a heart full of faith, and people, good people, who stood beside her, not in front of her. And sometimes, that was enough to change the world. The celebration that healed more than wounds. The sun rose on Eid morning with a kind of golden grace that felt like a quiet blessing, spilling its light over the cracked sidewalks, the slanted rooftops, and the narrow alleyways of South Central Los Angeles. But in one modest corner of the neighborhood, something felt different, like the air itself had decided to slow down and bear witness to the quiet triumphs of people who had suffered long and loved hard. And at the heart of it all, Amina stood with her hands pressed together, eyes closed, whispering a prayer of deep gratitude. She had woken before dawn, the habit of Ramadan still pulsing in her bones, but this morning, her fatigue was draped in joy. She stood in the center's tiny kitchenette, heating tea and adjusting trays of dates, pastries, and fruit that neighbors had brought the night before. It was a modest feast by most standards. But to her, it was a banquet carved out of faith, community, and grace. The center had been transformed overnight. The walls, once bare and quiet, were now strung with paper garlands, handmade stars, and strings of lights that flickered like fireflies in a jar. Children's drawings lined the entrance, each one more colorful than the last. Depictions of mothers, mosques, and joy wrapped in crayon hearts. And right at the door stood a sign, scribbled in marker by Sami himself, "Welcome to the House of Dreams." Amina hadn't changed it. She couldn't, because in those 4 words her son had captured the very soul of what they were building. Families began to arrive just after sunrise, women in bright hijabs and soft smiles, some holding toddlers in their arms, others carrying small boxes of sweets. Laughter filled the space quickly, shoes lined up by the door. Hugs were exchanged like old currency, and every woman who entered knew she wasn't a guest. She was home. Keanu arrived quietly, as always. He wore a simple white shirt and loose black pants, carrying a tray of homemade baklava from a Lebanese bakery he had discovered just the day before. The kids flocked to him like he was an uncle returning from faraway lands, not a Hollywood star. And to them, that's exactly what he had become, family. Amina greeted him with a warm smile, her hand briefly brushing his as she took the tray. "You really didn't have to." "I wanted to," he said, his voice soft, eyes scanning the room. "This is beautiful, Amina. You made this happen." She shook her head. "We made this happen." But even as the celebration unfolded, and joy radiated from every corner, Amina couldn't help but feel the weight of something else creeping into the edges of her thoughts, a kind of sacred responsibility. Because while today was about celebration, she knew that tomorrow would return them all to the ongoing struggle, bills, broken systems, and invisible battles that didn't pause for holidays. She had built something, yes, but how could she protect it? How could she make sure it lasted? She tried to push the thoughts away, focusing instead on the dance of children in the center of the room. Sami led a game, his arms stretched wide like airplane wings, while Layla clung to his back, giggling with wild delight. Nearby, a group of mothers circled together, sharing recipes and stories, their eyes glowing with pride. And in that moment, something clicked in Amina's heart. This wasn't just about the building. This wasn't about having a space. It was about what the space represented. Safety, community, dignity. And those were things that couldn't be measured in rent checks or budget spreadsheets. They were measured in how people felt when they walked through the door, and she would fight for that feeling, no matter what came next. Later that afternoon, as the room emptied slowly and families drifted back home with warm plates and tired children, Keanu approached her. He stood beside her in silence for a while, both of them watching Layla sleep curled under a table draped in decorative cloth. "You're thinking about what happens next," he said gently, not asking, just knowing. Amina nodded. "I want it to last. Not just for my kids, for everyone. I want them to have something no one can take away." Keanu reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He handed it to her without ceremony. "This isn't just money," he said. "It's a step toward permanence, toward something that can't be swept away by rent increases or policy changes. It's a down payment for the purchase of this space. I already spoke with the landlord." Amina stared at the envelope like it was glowing. "You're serious?" "I'm always serious when it comes to building something real." She didn't cry. Not this time. The tears had come and gone, like rainstorms clearing out old soil. Instead, she laughed, softly, like a woman remembering how good it felt to believe in miracles again. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," he replied. "Just keep doing what you're doing. That's more than enough." That evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline and the call to Maghrib prayer echoed faintly from a nearby mosque, Amina stood on the steps of the center and watched the city breathe. For the first time, she wasn't afraid of what tomorrow would bring. She wasn't overwhelmed by the unknown. Because she had built something real. Because she had people beside her. Because kindness, real kindness, had found its way into her life, not as a visitor, but as a permanent resident. And somewhere down the block, walking back toward his motorcycle, KeanuReeves smiled under the dusky sky, knowing that the truest roles he'd ever played were the ones no one would ever see on screen. The promise beyond the light. Weeks passed since Eid, but the warmth of that celebration never fully faded. The joy had soaked into the walls of the learning center like the scent of cardamom lingering in an old kitchen. Every time Amina unlocked the front door and stepped inside, she could still feel it, that pulse of belonging, of becoming. Life as it always did, settled back into its steady rhythm, with its demands and distractions, its bills and burdens. But something had changed permanently, not just in the space or in the people who came to it, but in Amina herself. She was no longer merely surviving the world. She was helping reshape it. The official purchase of the building had gone through with quiet efficiency. Keanu, true to his nature, never asked to put his name on any plaques or public announcements. When the papers were signed, he simply said, "This place belongs to them now," and disappeared into the background once more. He never sought to be the story. He only ever wanted to help someone else tell theirs. The center was named Noor House, chosen by the women who used it most. It meant House of Light in Arabic, a place where dignity wasn't something given or taken, but something everyone walked in with, no questions asked. It was a space for healing, for laughing, for starting again. And slowly, word of it began to spread beyond the neighborhood. Reporters came and went, some curious about this quiet place growing like a rose from concrete. But Amina only ever agreed to interviews under one condition. She didn't want it to be about her. She wanted it to be about the women, the children, the lives being transformed through education, language, and shared kindness. When someone inevitably asked about Keanu's involvement, she would smile and say, "He's a friend who believes in people." And that's all you really need to know. Keanu visited less frequently as the months passed. He never said goodbye. He didn't need to. His part of the story had always been to help her begin hers. But whenever he was in town, he'd drop by unannounced, usually during the quiet hours when classes were over and the kids were coloring or cleaning up. Sometimes he brought books, sometimes fresh fruit. Sometimes he just sat on the floor, reading with Layla, who now called him Uncle Keanu, with a kind of pride that made him chuckle every time. One evening, nearly a year after their first meeting, Amina stood at the front of a small graduation ceremony in the center. 10 women were receiving certificates for completing a basic English and job skills course. They stood tall, some in tears, some holding trembling hands. These were women who had come in fearful and silent, and now laughed loudly, spoke confidently, and looked people in the eye. And Amina, she didn't just teach them. She walked with them, listened to them, reminded them they mattered. Keanu was there too, sitting quietly in the back, watching it all unfold. He hadn't been invited. Amina never invited him anymore. She didn't need to. He always knew when to show up, like some part of his spirit was tethered to the space they had built together. After the certificates were handed out and the room buzzed with celebration, Amina walked to the back and sat beside him. "They're incredible," he said, motioning to the women now holding hands, posing for pictures. "They are," she said, her voice thick with pride. "And this is just the beginning." Keanu leaned back, a rare look of deep reflection on his face. "You know," he said slowly, "people always ask me why I care so much about strangers. And the truth is, we're not strangers. Not really. We're just people walking through the same fire in different shoes." Amina smiled, remembering the days when she had felt invisible, voiceless, buried beneath the weight of her pain. "Thank you," she said again, "not for the building or the money or the name, but for the belief, the seed, the light." "I didn't do this," he said quietly, gesturing toward the center. "You did. I just held the flashlight while you found the path." And she believed him, because she had lived it. In the months that followed, Noor House expanded. New classes opened. Child care services were added. A donated van allowed pickups and drop-offs for mothers who couldn't otherwise attend. And young girls, like Layla, began to grow up in a world where they saw their mothers leading, creating, healing. Not because someone saved them, but because someone reminded them they didn't need to be saved. Amina went on to speak at schools, panels, and interfaith events, always sharing the same message. That true strength often wears the face of a tired mother, that hope can be planted in the harshest of soil, and that when people meet each other with kindness instead of judgment, miracles become possible. And through it all, Keanu remained a constant, sometimes distant, sometimes close, but always present. He became a silent partner in every step forward, a whisper in the walls of Noor House, a chapter in a story that belonged to many. Years later, when Sami graduated high school and gave a speech about where he came from, he told the crowd that everything good in his life started when his mother was finally seen. And somewhere in that audience, seated in the far back row in a weathered black jacket, KeanuReeves wiped away a tear and smiled. Because in a world that often rushes past quiet pain, he had chosen to stop, to listen, to lift. And in doing so, he had helped a single mother during Ramadan. But more than that, he had helped light a fire that would warm generations. The story didn't end when the fast was broken. It began there. And it lives on every time someone chooses empathy over ego, compassion over convenience. And so, under faded city skies and behind the humble door of a place called Noor House, the light never stopped shining.